So to continue, we talked about there are uncommon words, words that students may not see or hear often, but that are critical to the content that they need to process. There are words that have multiple meanings. Think about the use of the term cell in everyday language versus the way we use the term cell when we're talking about biology. Very, very critical that students understand those differences. We have instructional or academic words that often are used in school, things that give us direction, that we use to give directions to students. So like to synthesize, which means I'm going to draw from several sources and create meaning, or elaborate, meaning I'm going to expand on a concept or a thought. All of those things. To critique, so to critically evaluate something. Those are words students need often to be able to complete the assignments that we give them with a high degree of skill. And then there are sophisticated synonyms, words used in instruction that have more common terms. So vertigo, I was diagnosed with vertigo this summer, no fun. But what it really means is you're very dizzy. Well, most children know what dizzy means, but they need to learn that vertigo is another word for dizzy, or that harass, which most students know the meaning of that, is another term for beleaguer, right? Okay. So identifying conceptual vocabulary is very, very important. And so if you look at this example here, bacteria are a class of microscopic plants that help people, other animals, and plants. However, bacteria also do things that hurt people, other animals, and plants. Well, so what are bacteria? Let's see. They're microscopic. What does that mean? That means that I can't see them without a microscope, right? And I know that they can help people, animals, and plants, but they can also hurt people, animals, and plants. So I have to be able to think about that. And then we think about vocabulary associated with that general concept and its related concepts in terms of that conceptual vocabulary. So bacteria is small. You can use a microscope to see them. They multiply. They live in soil, water, organic matter, plants, or animals. They can make you ill. They can also spoil food. So now I'm getting a little better feel for what bacteria can do. And then if I look at that passage, I know that if children don't understand some of this terminology, they're going to have a very difficult time with this concept of bacteria. They've got to know bacteria. They've got to know what is a microscope. What does organic mean? And what does it mean for something to multiply? Does that mean that they do math? Right? So again, we need to really think clearly and strongly about that. I'm going to suggest that you pause the video now and you click on this link to the video of Anita Archer doing some vocabulary instruction with students. She particularly talks about the word allude, and I want you to look at all the ways and context in which she has students use that word and thinking about whether, it would almost be impossible to not know what that word meant following that lesson. I want you to think about that as a very rich and contextualized way of going about it. Okay, so go ahead and watch that video on your own. What are some ways that people teach vocabulary? Semantic maps. So let's say that we have an owl and we might think about what are their sleeping habits? What are their eating habits, right? How do they interact with other owls and other animals? And then we can build off of that. I'm sure all of you have at some point or another used a semantic map. Another commonly used way of reinforcing vocabulary or strategy is the Frayer Model. And so you put the term that's to be defined in the middle, and then you think about what is the definition of that? And again, a friendly definition. What are some characteristics of that term? What are some examples? And what are some non-examples? And so I'm going to show you a number of examples drawn from all different content areas. So think about in terms of historical fiction. Okay, there's a term that we might use in language arts, historical fiction. Well, what is that? Well, the definition provided is it's a novel set in the past that contains references to significant events in history. So it's a novel set in the past, and some of it's going to be about history, right? But the writer is going to blend factual information with fictional characters, dialogue, details, and events. So it's based on things that really happen in history, but this is a story about that's fictionalized, right? So what are some characteristics of historical fiction? Well, it is based on historical fact. It's set in the past. It's set in a real time and place, something that really happened. But some fictional aspects are included, such as characters, details, and events. So let's give some examples. A novel about the Civil War. One of my favorites is a book called Across 5 Aprils by Irene Hunt. Story about a fictional family during the Great Depression. Okay, you can probably all think of several of those. Esperanza Rising by Paul Munoz. Number the Stars by Louise Lowry, which is written about the Holocaust. So again, you've got some really concrete examples of what is historical fiction, and then you have some non-examples. A general's personal account of the events leading to the Iraq War. That's not fictionalized. It's what this general remembers, right? A story about a family who lives on the moon. As far as we know, there are not families living on the moon, so that would not be historical fiction because it's not set in a context that is real, right? The Lord of the Rings by Tolkien or Tuck Everlasting, all of those have elements of fantasy that wouldn't be typical of historical fiction. Think about the Frayer Model when we use math. So the term quadrilateral, a polygon with 4 sides and 4 angles, right? That's the definition of a quadrilateral. 4 sides, 4 angles. Characteristics, the sum of all the interior angles is 360 degrees. There are exactly 4 sides. There are exactly 4 angles. There are 2 diagonals, meaning the cross, right? It's a closed figure. There is no opening, right? The line is solid. Some examples, a parallelogram, a rhombus, a square, a rectangle, a trapezoid. Those are all examples of a quadrilateral. However, circle, triangle, oval, straight line, star, and octagon are non-examples. Again, something very concrete. Are you going to do a Frayer model during your classroom instruction with 10 terms? No, but you might do it with 3 to 5 that are really critical for students to understand, and then they actually have something that they can go back and reference as they work through that. You have an example here of science, of physical property, and a social studies example of the term nomadic. What I want you to do is look at these and think about how this is a model that you can use to make vocabulary instruction very concrete for your learners, okay? We went through and practiced the vocab strategy in class. I just want to remind you that's when I gave you the index cards. The first thing we did is we talked about those terms and we put them on concepts. Then I had you organize into a diagram that demonstrated the relationships among those words that made sense for you. I had you share your reasoning with a partner, and then I gave you an opportunity to assess your diagrams and compare and to rearrange if there were ideas that you had learned that you hadn't thought of previously. And then one of the things I could have done is continue to add new vocabulary to that and have you restructure those words as we move through a unit of instruction. So I want you to remember that we took that back and we tried it with respect to some of the vocabulary terms in that passage that I had given you at the beginning of class. Okay. All right. So now let's think a little bit about contextual analysis. One of the things that we can often do is be able to determine word meanings just by carefully analyzing the way they're used in a text. Sometimes the sentence that they're used in actually provides a definition, or a synonym is used to illustrate what that word means, or there's a description of that term provided. Sometimes we learn what the opposite or an opposite or contrasting term, and sometimes there are comparisons made in sentences that give us some keys to what that vocabulary really is. Okay. Morphemic and structural analysis are tools we use. Many of you have been using some morphemic and structural analysis as we're teaching children to decode words in terms of breaking them down into their smallest meaningful parts. It's most effective when it's paired with that contextual analysis. So again, we look for these clues that sentences might provide, and then we go through and think about word parts and word meanings. So the first thing we do in the outside-in strategy is we look outside the word at context clues in the neighboring words and sentences to see if we can kind of figure it out. And then I look at that word that I'm not sure of and I try to think about, does it have a prefix or a suffix? What are the word parts? What is the root word? And then I can reread that section, keeping those meaningful word parts in mind, and I can make an inference about what that word means. So I want you to remember that as we talk about strategies, remember we said that some students need to use strategies more than others. And I want you to remember that as you consider your instruction, and particularly your instruction for children who need something more concrete. Many of you may kind of use this outside-in strategy automatically. No one had to teach it to you. But for some children, it is going to require that direct instruction and opportunities to practice. One caution is that many words contain syllables that are spelled the same as common morphemes that don't carry the same meaning. And so I do want you to think about that, and you have to be very careful in your own word choices to make sure that when you tell a child that's a prefix, that it really is a prefix